So this is the ad that literally changed my life. It was 2010. I was looking for a job in new media, and I decided to take out a Facebook ad and point it at decision makers at the hottest companies in Austin. So the way I did that was targeting by company name, the startups I wanted to work for, and I also targeted by phrases that were in Facebook bios. So for instance, Chief Marketing Officer. Someone was vain enough to put it in their bio. VP of Marketing. And I actually don't blame them, because at that time, there wasn't a field for job title. Lately, Facebook has caught up. They have it now. I spent only $200, and a few weeks later, I had my dream job. And at that time, it was the social media manager position, the first of its kind at Bizarre Voice, which many of you may be familiar with, in Austin, Texas, where I lived for 11 years before moving here. And I started thinking about what this meant. It wasn't just a fluke. What did this ad really mean? The fact that I was able to access these people and get traction. I decided that it was something I'd later call a social media side door. What that is a way around the gatekeepers and barriers that are constantly posing threats to our forward momentum and our ability to reach and influence the audience of our choosing. And I looked around, and I saw way more examples of this. So I found a pattern. Gatekeeping technologies and personnel, they follow the mass adoption of communications technologies. So if you go all the way back to the telephone, first you get secretaries being trained to screen out calls. That became a big part of their duties. And then you have later things like voicemail and caller ID. And there are still millions of gatekeepers today, as Steve said. It's people's job to basically make sure that the important people that they work for are able to focus on important things. And that often means keeping us out, you and I, especially in PR and marketing. I also noticed that the way we had been trained to do things, really since childhood, wasn't really working anymore. We were standing in line for what I call the front door, which is the way that you're told to get in, the way that everyone tells you to get access to something. But the reality is, for the best opportunities out there, in jobs and business and communications, you really can't get in through the front door, or it's incredibly hard, and you're better off devoting your energy to searching for a social media side door. And that social media democratizes reach and influence for the first time, to the extent that we're now able, as non-elites, to compete with elites for the same degree as access. But the trick is, the only way non-elites can get that access is through social media side doors. You can't plan on going viral, for example. That's not a plan or a strategy. But plans can incorporate finding these access points. And reach does not equal influence. The average customer, the average person, is easier to access than ever before. That's pretty obvious, right? Social media allows that. But it also makes the playing field that much wider, so that everyone can access that same audience. So you have millions of new competitors as soon as social media emerges for attention. And a lot of them are scrappy like you, or they're big corporate giants. And it doesn't really matter to the audience. So this playing field's getting flatter. Democratization, right? It's also getting wider. Like I said, you have to compete with more people than ever before. And we're entering this era that I call the end of assumptions, where it's no longer safe to assume anything about that audience. The data is there. There's data visibility to tell us, finally, exactly what they want, how they want it delivered, how you should approach them, and how you should speak to them. Even time of day stuff like we were learning earlier with the videos. That stuff's really important. And if you don't have that information, it's essentially your fault. It's something that you can do proactively, is develop the skills to acquire that data and analyze it, or hire the right people. And this is one of the great levelers as well, is those skills aren't necessarily expensive or hard to acquire. And a lot of big companies, they lack those skills in the right area too if you're trying to compete with them. So social media is giving us tons of data that we never had before about what people want. And the great news is that it's largely cheap or free. It's there for the taking. So I really believe that it's going to be a big differentiator, and already is. Which brings us to data literacy. And that's essentially the ability to use and understand data. When I talk about data literacy, of course, you might think of economists, data scientists, mathematicians, and that's at the extreme end of the spectrum. But I think the average marketing or PR team doesn't have the kind of data literacy that it really takes to compete today, or to excel, rather. And we need to start inculcating that ability in people that aren't in traditionally data literate jobs. So we hear so much about influencer relations. It's a hot topic. It's a growth industry. There are probably some of you here that are engaged in that field professionally. But I think that the way that we approach it typically is a little bit backwards. So typically we're looking for influencers that are existing. They have existing audiences. They've already earned their credibility with those audiences. And we're just kind of trying to get a piece of that. We're trying to get access through them to those audiences. But I think that an interesting approach is to actually grow with the influencers. So find them when they're emerging and use your brand and everything you have as a platform to allow them to grow as influencers. That relationship's going to be that much tighter. And frankly, it's going to be cheaper to cultivate. I think Instagram does an incredible job of this. So Instagram uses its own platform, its own account, to highlight people that are using the platform in interesting ways. It's pretty simple. So they're allowing their users to tell the Instagram story by how they actually use it. It's not from Instagram to the masses anymore. And that's almost the exclusive way that they use their own account. All companies, all brands are participatory to an extent. They have forces outside of their control. They're shaped by the market, by natural disasters, by all these things that they didn't anticipate or want. But the kind of participation I'm talking about today is really a deeper, more widespread, and most importantly, an invited participation. It's something that companies should be seeking out. Here's an example from Diane von Furstenberg. My company, Olympic, worked with them on their 40th anniversary of the iconic wrap dress. Of course, they could have done it like every other company and take out commercials and do a PR blitz and all these things, and I'm not saying they didn't do that. But what they did in addition was great. They invited their brand advocates to post photos and stories inspired by the dress and at events related to the dress, and then they integrated that deeply within their website and even put it on their homepage. They made it really a part of the brand. They invited them in deeply to participate in this iconic brand, which is a luxury brand, and you don't see that often. One of the most common questions I get is, what the heck does your Twitter handle mean? Any guesses? Exactly. Yeah. So she said, be present, be 3D, be here. And that's exactly right. It means be three-dimensional. By that, I mean be authentic. And authenticity is a buzzword. I know it. But when you see it, you know it's real. Like when you see real authenticity, it's unmistakable. And what I mean is, when you're engaging with an audience for the first time, you're kind of starting out in their mind as a flat image, something that's two-dimensional. And as you engage from different perspectives, different channels, with different messages, different parts of that audience, you're showing a different side of yourself every time. And you're building out your image in a way that's essentially three-dimensional in their mind. And I learned this the hard way when I was doing telephone sales. I was selling mobile marketing technology to realtors at the height of the recession. It was really difficult work. And I was getting hung up on all the time. They just didn't want to justify the spend. And what I noticed was, once I started blogging, and blogging about the challenges that they were facing and how social media could address those challenges, I got all sorts of comments. And I would go ahead, as part of my daily process, and call every single person that commented on my blog. And they weren't annoyed, and they didn't hang up, because I was three-dimensional in their minds. I was the person whose blog post had helped them so much that they commented on it. I was the person that had given them value already. They knew to a certain extent who I was. So instead of a stranger on the other end of the telephone, which I was before I started blogging, I was now the person that has that great blog. And I never got hung up on. I made a lot of sales that way. So another way to deepen that relationship and access audiences is to invite them backstage. Invite them into your brand in a deeper way. And most of us, myself included, couldn't care less what most companies, how they do what they do, where they source their materials for manufacturing, or what their CEO thinks about a specific issue. But a certain segment of your audience cares deeply about that stuff. They really care, and they crave insider status. They want to see backstage. They want to participate, like I said before. So to give them insider status, the good news is that it's actually fairly cheap and easy to do, because really what you're doing is carving a social media side door, an access point into what you're doing internally, and just giving them a peek in. And that's what Kate Spade does on their blog Behind the Curtain, which is one of the more literal examples I have in my presentation today. But it's a great one, because they have a blog dedicated to what inspires them, the kind of thinking that goes into their design, what color is going to be hot this season, all these things that a certain segment of the Kate Spade audience cares deeply about and wants to get inside that experience. What's it like to work there? It's wildly popular. On the bottom, you have a screenshot from GE. GE does this fascinating thing, again, so cheap and easy to implement, I'm surprised other companies don't do it, where they invite Instagrammers and brand advocates to some of their facilities, the more state-of-the-art ones, and they take them on these tours, and they ask them to take photos. That's the only request. And those photos end up on the GE website. They arrange them in such a way that tells a story. So you're essentially telling the GE story by brand insiders. And it's powerful. You're taking that storytelling out of the hands from one of the biggest brands in the world, which to a certain extent is a scary thing, but I think it resonates more deeply when you engage with insiders. So when I talk about engaging indirect and direct, what I'm saying is a message doesn't degrade as it passes from person to person in a network. Oftentimes, it gets stronger, right? This is kind of the reverse of matter. And the best approaches combine direct communications with audiences with trying to influence their peers and trying to get access in more of a roundabout way, simultaneously or one after the other. And here are a few examples from my own life. The top there, I was trying to get a job at a really hot startup here in New York. All of you have used it at least once. That's all I can tell you. And so the startup was, small but hard to get in. It's hard to speak with the people I need to speak with. I had applied directly. That was the direct approach. Wasn't getting any traction there. And So I went back to my roots, so to speak, and took out a Facebook ad. And I targeted people that worked at that company, because by that time you could do that. And I asked them a very simple request. Go to this page, which was on my blog, read my resume and what I have to say, and then tell your CEO about it. And a few days later, I got that email on top, CEO's colleague, assistant, saying not only was he impressed, but he wanted to meet with me that weekend, over the weekend. That was incredible. The next example was I was trying to get in a publication, again, which you guys probably read every week or even daily. I was trying to get my writing in there. And so I was submitting my best work and trying and failing over and over. That was the direct approach I was taking. And I went back to my roots again, and instead of Facebook this time, I used LinkedIn. For whatever reason, that company was more prevalent on LinkedIn, more identifiable. And I did the same kind of thing, except this time I said, here's a link to my writing, read it, and tell the editor-in-chief what you think of it. And I got that email. And in fact, the telephone conversation that ensued, he told me that I had created a sensation within his company. This is a company with thousands of employees. And maybe he exaggerated, but it made me very proud. Okay, this is the only one where I can actually disclose the name at the bottom there, those two. This is Harvard Business Review. So for whatever reason, I didn't go to business school. I don't have the traditional background. And the Harvard Business Review was like the white whale, the icon. I needed to get my writing in the HBR. It was my obsessive goal for a while in 2010. And again, I had tried using the direct route. I had talked to their lower level editors. I had submitted what I thought at the time was my absolute best work. And in fact, I had withheld submitting from other publications. I had given them kind of like an embargo on my work, even though they never responded. And I decided to look for a social media side door. So what I found was someone that would later become my friend, David Armano, was actually blogging for them, and sometimes his blog posts would end up in the print edition, which was my ultimate goal. Blog's one thing, but I wanted to get in the print magazine, the glossy copy. And I saw this opportunity. One of his blog posts was actually inviting people to comment on what they thought the social media trends of 2011 would be. So I went for it. I took a lot of time thinking about it and tried to make mine stand out. And out of hundreds of comments, mine was one of only a few that he was really engaging with, and we were going back and forth and kind of developing it into what you see there, which was eventually, it was printed in the Harvard Business Review. So I can't claim that I've written for the Harvard Business Review, but I can claim that my words have appeared in it, which is pretty much the same. Touchstones. That same data visibility that I talked about earlier, that data's out there, and if you're not using it, you need to be. That data allows us to see what we have in common with our audiences and what members of that audience have in common with one another, which is sometimes more important. And this is kind of like a duh slide, right? Obvious. But what I think most companies get wrong is they assume that what they have in common with their audience and what their audience members have in common with one another is somehow related to what they do or somehow related to their connection with the audience. But oftentimes, more powerful touchstones exist kind of outside of that direct relationship. So, of course, you have a relationship with this audience, and that's a touchstone right there. But you need to look outside of that and see what they have in common outside of you. And this one is especially important for B2B, but it can work in B2C as well. You don't hear it often, but disagree with leaders. If someone writes a blog post on a company blog, if it's a CEO, for instance, and you want to engage with that person, you need to disagree with them sometimes when you're doing so honestly and constructively, because leaders are surrounded by yes people, formerly known as yes men. They are hearing yes all the time. They're rarely challenged. Their ideas are rarely challenged. But you know what? They crave that dissent. That's why a lot of them, even the Fortune 500 C-suite, are starting to go look at blogs more and more, use social media more and more. And by the way, just because they're not tweeting doesn't mean they're not on Twitter. You can look at a lot of information publicly, and they do. So if you want to really engage with someone at the top of an organization, disagree with them. Tell them why. Show them the way that you think. And then just like those sales calls to real estate agents I was talking about, once you do approach directly, you're going to have that much more of a chance to get their attention. Because you're not one of the yes people. You're not one of the salespeople that does the same thing as the yes people and tells them everything they do is right. You're one of the people that actually gave them the respect that they deserve by showing them that how your thinking differs with them. And blogs, Twitter, and all the things that alert us to when we're being written about, like pingbacks and Google Alerts, are incredibly useful tools for just this purpose. They will find out. A CEO of a Fortune 50 company will find out if you dissent with his or her opinion. You just need to make sure that they find out. So you hear a ton about companies becoming human. Well, there's a guy named Tim Lebrick that told me something that I found really fascinating. He said, that's the worst thing that could ever happen. Humans are pretty terrible sometimes. Humans have a lot of tendencies we do not want to have within companies, right? So his term of choice was humanistic. So that's the one I use. You need to emulate your audience by becoming more humanistic and figuring out their thoughts and desires and how they talk. And a good concrete example of this is when I worked at Bazaar Voice. Remember my former dream job? What we sold, if you're not familiar, was ratings and review systems. So a platform that hosted and collected and displayed product reviews. Pretty much everywhere but Amazon was powered by Bazaar Voice. Thousands of millions and billions of pieces of data about how people talk about products. What we noticed was the way that people were talking about products in reviews was so different than the way that companies were talking about their own products, which isn't very surprising, but you kind of need to rattle your clients sometimes and tell them that. And I'm not just talking about negative reviews. Of course that's different than the way companies are promoting their products. I'm talking about the positive ones. So what we decided to advise our clients to do is start using patterns in that language and word choice from those consumers in their marketing copy, press releases, advertisements. And sure enough, by whatever success metrics you had laid out for those media, you would see improvements if you did this consistently. You were emulating your audience when and where it made sense to the point where your brand is becoming humanistic, but again, not fully human because we don't want that. So social proof is a heuristic, which is a word for a mental shortcut that we use to make decisions. And the social proof heuristic tells us to make the same choices that others are choosing. So we're constantly, humans, looking for evidence of what other humans are doing and subconsciously trying to go in that same direction. And social media brings social proof to the fore, to the surface. All these indicators that you hear about, like Twitter followers, clout scores, things like this, you also hear that they're useless, right? Well, I disagree. I think that they're useless in isolation, but they can be really powerful to be evidence of your activity. Because essentially what you're doing by having, a lot of Twitter followers or a lot of LinkedIn connections or whatever it is that you care about is showing the world that others care about what you have to say and that they're connecting with you and that they're interested in what you have to say. So in my Facebook ad, this may have been version B, I don't remember which one I showed you, but highlighted in green there is my social proof. I had been nominated for a 2010 Texas Social Media Award. And here's the secret. You could nominate yourself. I didn't lie, though. But that was social proof. It signaled that people cared enough about what I had to say to nominate me for this award. Jeremiah Oyang, friend of mine, in the center there, that's a video still from his media reel. Now, media reels are used for two things, one of which we're already familiar with, of course, is to show producers that you're comfortable on camera, that your CEO is comfortable on camera, and they're going to want to choose him. But the other reason that we don't often think about is social proof. You're also showing that producer that other producers care who this guy is. So that's a modern form of social proof in video form. Same principle applies to what I call these brag banners that you see on websites. It's showing the media coverage that you've got. And Clout Score, like I mentioned earlier, say what you want about it. I know it's a divisive topic, but it does one thing really well, and it's condense your influencer status or notoriety into a single number. And for people that will buy into that, that can be important. So that can be powerful social proof. This guy took it to a whole nother level, though, and actually took out a press release bragging about his Clout Score, which this was before they recalibrated the algorithm, and honestly, 68 was not that high. So that made it even funnier. And I hope I'm not the only one giving public presentations lambasting this guy, because he deserves it. Tweet at him if you want. What's his name? TJ Kurgan. Be indispensable. There are very few formulas in social media, right? No hard and fast rules. Anyone that's trying to tell you that is kind of a huckster. But one thing that you do find in common with all the most successful social media strategies is that they're almost ruthless about making sure that they're providing value constantly to their audience. And this seems like one of those ideas, of course, yeah, it makes sense. But when you see it in action, it's really powerful. So Adobe had, I guess, a bunch of products they wanted to sell to CMOs, a suite of products. And instead of launching the marketing and communications blitz right away, they decided to create a website dedicated to the problems that CMOs had, i.e. their audience, and creating content to help them solve those problems. You guys know CMO is the shortest tenure of all positions in the C-suite. It's 18 months, and that's actually a high point. It used to be 12 months. These people are under a lot of pressure. And there wasn't a resource out there dedicated to helping them succeed. And that seemed absurd to Adobe. And in retrospect, it should seem absurd to all of us. So this brand stepped in, not a news organization, but they hired journalists. And they create a ton of content, and it's incredibly successful. You want to play to your audience's ego. Everyone has them. And if you're in B2B, realize that organizations have organizational pride, which can be seen as an ego as well. And most companies don't use the ego effectively. They shy away from it because they consider it tacky to approach and engage with the human ego. But it's just part of us, like anything else. And I think that you can do it in a non-tacky way, and I'm going to show you an example of that. Waiting for it to load up here. Okay. So imagine you were trying to figure out a way to get thousands of the hippest consumers in your audience to share something with your logo on it. That's a really tall order, right? You have to kind of stumble upon it. And I'm not sure that was Converse's goal, but they ended up doing it because at South by Southwest, they took out these photo booths. They put them up at a fairly exclusive concert. You had to had some kind of like VIP pass to get in, even though thousands of people were in attendance. So that tells you about the quality of the phrase VIP. And they asked people to take these kind of GIF images of themselves and share it. And thousands of people, tens of thousands of people did. So what does that say? It tells us that people love sharing things that kind of help them create the image of themselves that they're trying to show the world. And if you're a brand, you can create tools that empower them to do so. And at least I don't think this is tacky. This is benefiting both. And so this is the last slide where I talk about the future a little bit. Now, I think in 5 years, if we're thinking about, say, today at this conference, or any point this year, we're going to be bewildered by the memory of the kind of access, the ways we were accessing one another and influencing one another through social media. It's going to really astonish us. I can't believe we did that back then. It's going to be like when you're sitting around in your neighborhood and saying, I can't believe we used to leave the doors unlocked overnight here. And I think this is unstoppable, though, because the democratization of access and influence, that's not going to stop. That's going to keep on going. In fact, it's such an ingrained part of social media. And you see things like Facebook, for instance, making sure that you don't get as much organic reach on your Facebook page, and you have to kind of pay to play now, right? But then you also see examples of pages that never take out ads that are super successful. And Facebook knows, and all these companies know, that with the ability to shut these side doors in social media, they're also going to lose their audience if they do so completely. Because one of the big reasons we use social media, whether we realize it or not, is because it provides that instant connection, that open degree of connection to one another. So as long as social media exists, social media side doors will exist. Thank you.